annual visits to our place, and we'd like to discuss a few things about Pete. What do you think of all these hubris that is going on in India now about the student unrest? You were once a student activist or sort of things like you were into the student stuff.
Yeah. So I'm 62 years old, and I started college in 1971 in the U.S. And that was a little bit later than the very intense period, which was in about 1968. But I still felt, I still got caught up in the student movements.
Leftist.
Yeah, so
What was it, a leftist?
they were labeled as leftists only because they were against the Vietnam War. Okay, and that was the focal point for all of the protests, because we were being drafted. As soon as you finish high school, you were eligible for the draft, and I got a draft card just like everyone else, and there was a very real possibility that you would be sent to Vietnam and have to kill people. And my friends and I didn't like that. And there were also some very good political arguments against the war. It wasn't just a conscientious objector thing, which my friends and I were against killing, but there was also a lot of political reasons why people, you know, didn't think it was a good war. So there were a lot of protests. There were marches on Washington. There were, it was a big movement. There was also the civil rights movement.
I know,
But-
I know.
yeah.
I know. The anti-war movement. But the thing is, all right. So, what is the alternative? Like you know that the war was actually sort of forced on the United States. Okay, it's not that you had much choice. Like they were moving the missiles in the backyard of U.S. They were nuclearizing. They are moving the nuclear missiles there. Okay, that is a strategic threat.
Yeah.
That is just across your borders, Cuba and Castro's bringing in these nuclear missiles and giving them a base there.
Yeah.
So actually, this war, anti-war, and all is nice. But then, what do you do if United States does not somewhere draw the red line and say you cannot keep expanding? So, do you really think the anti-war movement then had an answer, adequate intellectual answer to what the enemy is doing? Like in India right now, you see, they have all try to project these convict terrorists, mind you. Some of these terrorists have attacked the parliament. So the parliament stands on the constitution. The constitution guarantees the freedom of speech and all liberties. So when you attack the foundation, the very foundation of it, there's no debate there. So you see, it is actually an attack on freedom of speech. It is not it is not an attack on what do you call it? It is not a debate between two issues, and that you demand the right. You have the right to speak, but you cannot say others will be gunned down. So these are the guys who are gunning down people.
Right.
That is not actually freedom of speech.
Right.
It is an attack on freedom of speech.
Right.
It is an attack on constitution that guarantees freedom of speech.
Right.
So similarly, don't you think that when you are young, of course, don't you think that you have outgrown some of these ideas you were having back then?
Yeah, I think I think the main difference between what you're saying and what I was facing in the Vietnam War is that the Vietnamese were not coming over to us and attacking us in our country. So there was something called the domino theory. The domino theory was we have to stop them now in Vietnam, otherwise Malaysia will fall.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Did they have an answer? Like
Right.
your movement, it's fine that we don't want to fight a war. Someone else
Yeah,
wants,
yeah.
especially things
Yeah.
like that. What was the answer to Soviet? What was the answer to Soviet expansionism?
Well, so my friends and I really believed that having Vietnam as a buffer, okay, and it wasn't a Stalinist communist regime. It was, they had their own particular style of communism, and having that as a buffer would actually prevent the domino effect.
No. But then it doesn't stop with Vietnam. They were very clear about it. They are expanding into Philippines. They want to expand into Malaysia. They want to expand further south. Tibet, for example, came much later than Vietnam. See, the expansionism didn't stop.
Yeah. Well, Vietnam and China were enemies back then. And
Wait a minute. There. We are talking about communist expansionism. We are not talking about the particular what you call brands of communism. It's both. It is true. At that time, they were a monolith like the Soviet imperial, Soviet empire, if you can call it. But then that because this empire broke into two doesn't make it any less evil or that it is more desirable. That this communist, we are talking about the laws of democratic states and the rolling wave of communist expansionism, communist dictatorship.
Yeah.
So that is what we have to see there. So the Tibetan expansion came, and Soviet expansion kept going on. You had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so much. They kept on. Afghanistan was there; it stopped. And by the time it came to Afghanistan, the policy was reversed, and the nation didn't protest. When Afghan invasion took place, all Americans were together in saying that the invasion has to be rolled back.
Right. So
my question is different. It is like, don't you see that in those younger days, there were things that you couldn't see better? Perhaps you would have chosen differently today.
Yeah, but I think that the fact that Vietnam is not part of a big communist conspiracy now, after Saigon fell and the North Vietnamese took over the whole country, the U.S. finally just gave up and withdrew, and the quote communists took over, and look what we have now. It's not a big, huge, monolithic communist empire. It's Vietnam. It's a sovereign state that has their own politics and priorities, and it's not.
No, but the expansionism did stop. You see, the idea of going to war both in Korea and later in Vietnam was to tell the Soviets very clearly that we will not be simply watching you keep gobbling up one country after the other. Okay, that you succeeded in making that message clear. But the expansionism did keep going on. I told you China gobbled up Tibet later, and then they entered into Afghanistan. You see, the expansionism didn't stop. They were trying, but then they were told that we would be there.
Right.
We will not be watching. So in a way, but the movement, they did have an answer to communist expansion.
So what was happening then was Chinese volunteers, soldiers were coming from China. Vietnam was in a bind. They didn't know where else to go for help. So they went to their old enemy, China, and started accepting volunteers, and they started becoming more and more friendly with China and allowing Chinese influence into Vietnam. If we didn't go to war with Vietnam, they would have remained enemies with China, like they have been for thousands of years.
No, because the Chinese were Chinese under the Mao had very clear militaristic views about it. Okay. Actually, when you look into the records, you see that it was Mao who wanted it.
More what?
It is Mao who wanted it. Okay, he wanted to take over much of the battle on the ground was done by most soldiers, most good soldiers. The Vietnamese army collapsed, and both the Vietnamese Communist Party also collapsed. It was most people who were on the ground, and he was willing to sacrifice millions over this kind of conflicts. But my question is not that whether if we withdrew. Probably there have been enemies. Okay, probably there have been enemies, or probably they've been like North Korea and China today.
Yeah.
You see? So they are of the same ideological spectrum.
Yeah.
They're not exactly in friendly terms. You can't say that China and North Korea are in friendly terms, but in tactical terms, they are. They are acting as one. It's kind of a proxy state there. And North Korea, even whether it is not in the same group as China, it still poses an independent problem to you. But the question is about communist expansionism back then.
Right.
Okay.
No, I mean the general population did very much think what you're saying, that it's a monolithic worldwide sort of conspiracy, and we need to stop them. And the domino theory was in people's minds.
It's not a theory,
but
it is
my
a fact, right?
you
see, there's the difference between Western interventionism after the Second World War. and the Soviet expansion. There's a huge difference between these two. When these movements that oppose this intervention of the Western powers in these countries where the communists and the Soviets were trying to obtain a foothold, their thrust of the argument is to project that it is a kind of a military ambition and expansionism, but that is not the case. Nowhere United States took over a country. Okay, they went there, set up some corrective, they withdrew. It was not actually a military occupation. It was not the case with the Soviet Union. The whole of the Eastern Bloc went under the influence of the Soviets. They crushed even an uprising for democratic rights in Hungary.
Right.
Okay, the student uprising.
Right.
And another thing I would add is the whole student movement that you people participated in the United States was driven by the same kind of leftists who justified and endorsed this crushing of student uprising in Hungary, the sending of the tanks into Hungary, in the kind of horrific things they did to the students. Like, for example, the same kind of leftists who justified this, anti-war campaign. They are the ones who would actually stand together with the Chinese oppression in Tiananmen Square. If you read carefully, you'll see that they are in sympathy with it. They are justifying it. I'll put it this way, they're anti-nuclear movement. Take anti-nuclear movement. Another movement probably you are not part of. You see that this is a part of another two wings. Okay, so it started two wings of propaganda. That is to abuse your power. The Western capitalist world offers some rights for people, the freedom of speech, association, to protest, stuff like that, which they do not, ironically. Okay, and they float all these fronts. Okay, that are actually calling themselves as democratic. Usually, the word "peoples" will be added. People's power, people's this, and democracy will be added. Democratic students movement, democratic this and that, but it is all about justifying the Soviet stand back then. Okay, so when you look at it, look at this movement, anti-nuclear movement, they were never addressing this problem of Soviet buildup of nuclear missiles. They're always talking only about the Western buildup of nuclear missiles. You have any amount of literature. Okay, but that is why I said you won't be aware of it. Maybe you are not into that movement. Okay, so what I'm asking is, there was no answer for this Soviet expansionism. Like you said, the domino theory, it wasn't a theory. As I told you, if it is a theory, then Tibet shouldn't happen. Afghanistan shouldn't happen. So if it is just a theory or a conspiracy theory or just a theory or a thought that if you give up one place, they will go for the next. If it is just a theory, they shouldn't have happened, but it's part of history. So it did expand. It is not that if you just allow Cuba to be taken, they won't try Brazil or they won't try. They were trying all the time.
Yeah, I mean, all I can tell you is back then we really thought that basically the Vietnamese were had the label communism, but they were really it was really, Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist movement, and it happened to have an economic flavor that resembled communism, but they weren't Ho Chi Minh wasn't necessarily trying to ally themselves with the Soviet Union or China. They were just doing their own thing. And that's what my friends and I thought back then.
You believe that they were just not what it is usually being projected, and then that being used as an excuse for military adventures outside America, which are needless wars basically, and that this entire draft is based on such a what you call a construed artifice of a cause, which is not really nationalistic. That was how you looked at it. I can see how the argument was made, but you see, come back to this question that they didn't really have another alternative or an answer to that till Ronald Reagan came about and evolved this doctrine of containment, and he went there to challenge Afghanistan. You see, when Afghan invasion made Soviets feel it is very costly, unsustainable, drained them, Soviet Union collapsed. Not before that. But I saw some of these in Peter, some of these writers, they actually show that when Gorbachev started the Perestroika movement, Soviet economy is doing well. With statistics, believe. In other words, what he's saying is, if only they had held the ground, the hardliners held the ground, supported the war there, Afghanistan, not withdrew, and then held the ground. Okay, like the CCP is doing. And they have a point. CCP did the same thing. Soon after Perestroika and the fall of Soviet Union, the communist Chinese students and the youth felt that time has come now that we can bring down this dictatorship and we can go for democracy and an open society and a free market. Free market, yeah, but non-free markets cannot be sustained without democracy. There is an argument like that. China has successfully sustained that. But coming to that, what they are trying to say is, when you look at the Soviet withdrawal from that hardline position and agreeing to open up and then dismantle the whole thing, and you look at the Chinese thing, we really, we had a kind of, we were lucky because you see, the communists, they refused to budge. They crushed the student movement. And then they enforced discipline. So our communists here would disagree with that and then say this is a risk, but then they kept quiet. They made no noise. The leftists kept quiet as the communists crushed the student movement in Tiananmen Square. We don't know how many of these students lost their lives or where they went, or they simply disappeared. And they never dared to enter back into mainland China. They just went to Hong Kong, and when China later took up Hong Kong, they fled from there. So there's so much for your leftist activism. This is what is the thing. What I'm trying to say is the student movement, okay, we have a double standard again in the left movement. That when they, like I said, the example of Hungary, the Soviets crushed with tanks the student uprising in Hungary, and they didn't say anything about it. They didn't organize worldwide protests against the crushing of democratic rights.
I'm not sure about that. I think they
didn't. This was one thing, you can check it out. They didn't. The leftists kept quiet. There are two things they kept quiet about. One was the constant buildup of Soviet Union of nuclear missiles. They were not, when they were anti-nuke, it was always, it goes without saying, they're talking about the American buildup and the NATO buildup of the nuclear missiles. They never ever attacked Soviet Union as responsible for fueling the nuclear war.
Well, I think their theory was that if America reduced their stockpile, then the Soviet Union would say, well, we don't need to maintain.
It doesn't follow. How does it follow? You don't. Okay, it follows, maybe not. But then you should, as far as when you're addressing an issue, you have to address both these people who are party to it. You can clearly see that these students were naive, and then this whole movement, anti-nuclear movement and argument was directed against the Western build-up, cleverly keeping out what the Soviet side was doing. They are deploying these missiles all over Eastern Europe where they had no business to be. And that is not seen as now with the same kind of focus of opposition, like United States moving its building up its base in Japan, or for example.
I just remember I wasn't really involved in the anti-nuclear movement, but I do remember the basic message that was being put across was, we've got a Hiroshima for every man, woman, and child. A Hiroshima explosion, enough for every man, woman, and child. That doesn't make sense. And whether the Soviet Union's got 7,000 or 5,000, even 1,000 is too many.
No. I get your point, but then nukes don't discriminate between Americans and Russians. But then you're completely not confronting the issue here. You are absolutely powerless when it comes to the enemy. You're not able to tell him the same thing. Why don't you tell them the same thing? You're not. In a way, this kind of, addressing always your own side. Okay, just because you can do that, because you have the democratic right, and never the other side where there is no such democratic right. Their own people can't even do that. The students in Soviet Union cannot even dream of doing anything like you did against your government.
Yeah, but I do remember there being contact between groups in Russia and the groups in the U.S. And I have a postcard from Russia talking about.
Yes, there were, no doubt. Yes, in fact, you are putting it this way, like this. You don't get it. Like, it is not like Soviet Union. Nobody can argue that Soviet Union had the same kind of democratic rights and freedom to dissent, so much so that the students could organize and have contact with you. No, they would do that only on condition that the KGB overlooks it, and then they see what kind of. Otherwise, they won't. If you are seriously going to suggest that in Soviet Union was not a police state, then I'm out of this debate.
Yeah.
You cannot.
Well-
You see, the kind of things they did, there was no freedom inside Soviet Union.
I don't really know much about it, but I do remember hearing about the student movements here
Yeah.
that were
That
anti
is
wait
natural.
wait
That
that
is
were
natural.
that were anti-war.
Yeah.
Were in contact with the
Yes.
and it was all
naturally because the student movements here, as I pointed out, were always pointing their fingers at their own government. You see, that serves your purpose.
Yeah,
if
yeah.
I am if I am the Soviet Union, I would like to encourage more of it. And I'll ask some of my own party people, the communist parties, to set up in all these satellite countries, to set up this Czech French People's France German Friendship Society, and ask the Western German Student Union to come over here, have exchanges, because all of you are addressing only that side.
Yeah,
Okay.
But these guys were persecuted. I know those students in Russia were persecuted. They were real. I mean, they were for disarmament.
That is a
Disarmament. It was a
that is-
disarmament movement.
No, you can't. You can't do that even to begin with. You cannot do that even to begin with. The kind of things that you did, you can't even dream of doing it. Otherwise, why you think the people uprising came about in Soviet Union? They're tired of this repression there.
Right.
So let us not kind of play games with that. This is a fact. Soviet Union was an oppressive state,
Right.
and it denied rights,
Right.
and this is a fact. But what we are talking here about is the student movements. Okay, they had two peculiar tendencies. One is they were always attacking two things. On the military side, the military built the power of the Western powers, that is the nuclear buildup. But they're never talking of bringing in what the Soviets were doing. Second, even if they did, it's a mute point because Soviet Union does not respect their own students. They're not going to listen to you, and they're not going to allow, say, picketers to come into Moscow and hold placards like you can do in Washington. So it's a mute point. Okay.
Well, what I remember, the focus was disarmament. So the fact that we have nuclear weapons at all, any country, doesn't matter what country.
No.
The student groups were.
No, that is not by the stroke of argument. Let us imagine, say there are two countries like India and Pakistan or whatever it is, unilaterally disbands its nuclear weapons, and then since nuclear bombs don't discriminate between people and all that, it doesn't mean that on what do you proceed this argument with? You are assuming that the enemy will dismantle it. What if he doesn't? Then you're back to square one. So you see, suppose I say you take off all your nukes off, say reduce it by 50%. That is what the SALT agreement was, Reagan signed. And then you cut it down by 50%. Where is the guarantee other side is going to do it? Unless the other side agrees to do it. Right. So raising an argument like this, the question is something else. Why did the movement ideologically confront the Soviet side or the wrongs of the Soviet side? That's still there in history. These student movements look heroic because they were abusing the democratic rights of these capitalist and free societies. They were actually sort of operating inside these free space debates. They were actually sort of abused, as I told you. Everything is built on this constitution of your country and this system that you actually despise as capitalists. But then that is what is guaranteeing you that. While you are toothless against the other side, which will seek its destruction, mind you, it seeks its destruction and impose its own ideology in your country. Okay, but then against that you're toothless. Number one, they're not going to care whether 100 students passed in front of White House or not. Okay, so and moreover, their students are not given the same kind of freedom and things like that. So I believe the whole leftist student movement during your time only ended up in kind of making America sort of disarm it unilaterally a little bit and less aggressive in containment of the Soviet expansionism. Till Reagan had to come and do the corrective and say that we are, no matter what, going to be there and draw a red line. That is my understanding of it. All right. And apart from that, okay.
Yeah.
So why I'm talking about it is in context of right now we have this student unrest going on in India with the same kind of argument. Forgetting that there are no rights for the Kashmiris inside Pakistan. The Punjabi army has taken over all the lands of the ethnic Kashmiris, but not a word is said about it. And then there is no democratic right within this, the Kashmiri Valley itself. And then about the minorities, the Hindus happen to be a minority in the Kashmir Valley. They have been ethnically cleansed. So it is and again, this argument is wrong of freedom of speech because the freedom of speech is guaranteed by the Constitution and the Parliament. And when these are physically attacked and you say endorse those kind of actions are correct, okay, you are actually doing something that is an attack on what guarantees the freedom of speech.
I think you need to be careful though when you talk about like student movements, because we had very right-wing student movements too.
Oh yeah.
We had a movement called Young Americans for Freedom, and they boycotted. They didn't like the Great Boycott. They were pretty right-wing, and I actually went to a meeting as a spy once.
Well, fine, but that was nice. But what actually, of course, these are sweet memories and looking back, whether you were on the left and whether it was right, things like that. And moreover, that I just pointed out the ideological shortcomings of the movement. That was what I was called.
Yeah.
And next to what you call this, what about this? Wait a minute. This contemporary movement when it happened, like because you're an old timer and a student activist. The contemporary movement. The contemporary movement, by that I mean Occupy Wall Street. Did you play any role on it?
No, I didn't. I saw the protests. I didn't pay that much attention to it. I'm just an old geezer, I lost my youthful enthusiasm, and I really didn't, I was sort of neutral on it. But the other thing I want to say, the student movement in the U.S. back then was also very, very focused on civil rights. Half Vietnam, half civil rights. Civil rights was a very big issue. And
where do you stand on civil rights?
Yeah, I mean, my father was a politician, and he was very, very involved. I mean, we never had a cross burned in our yard, but we knew people that did. The Ku Klux Klan was doing that kind of thing, and
they're liberals, right?
The Ku Klux Klan? No,
No, I don't mean
no
KKK, but
yeah.
Your father.
Yeah.
You're a liberal.
Yeah, and
it
was a very big deal growing up in the '60s in the U.S. in terms of civil rights, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act helped a lot, but there was still a lot of lynchings. Every week, in Alabama there was. Or Mississippi, there were lynchings, and it was really bad. So
Mississippi burning.
Yeah. So a lot of white, youth movement people or students came from the north and went down to the south and did civil rights work. So there were two prongs to the student movement: civil rights and Vietnam. And really, a lot of people, they just didn't like the draft. They really didn't necessarily have any ideas about, whether Vietnam was, they just personally didn't want to go fight. And I had friends that had to work very hard and, do a lot to get conscientious objector status because they just didn't want to kill anyone. They didn't care for what cause. And that
I can understand it, but it's a little problematic. If you really don't want to kill people, sometimes you have to fight. Because the best example is the Iraq situation. You see, you didn't want to kill more, fight more, but you did. It ended up in horrific massacres later. It doesn't mean that if you refrain from fighting, sometimes you often end up in saving lives. Probably to cost more lives. So these are deep ethical debates, okay? So you cannot take positions on simplistic assumptions like that. But, the civil rights movement, I would say that it's good overall. I'm in agreement with it. In a way, we have the same situation here, more or less. India, there are certain things here too, some discriminative things and caste pro-equations and all that. It is not exactly racial. It's often exaggerated. But otherwise, we do have some remedial corrective measures in place, things like that. But having said that, you see, even any position when it is oversimplified and then taken dogmatic to the extreme ends in reverse discrimination. Yeah. So you could have noticed it, some amount of resentment among the whites that there's some reverse racism happening. Don't you think so?
Yeah, I mean, that was debated heavily for a number of years, and the general consensus was that, look, we had slavery for 150 years or whatever, and we need to compensate a little bit and
do something for it.
I mean,
you have to do something for it.
I mean, maybe some
make them a president or something.
Yeah, I mean,
and then take dictations from.
yeah, and so for blacks to get into college, they already had coming out of the gate a disadvantage. So let's give them preference, and people were okay with that. They were okay with that. There were a few people that
Yeah. By and large, yeah. Here too, by and large, this is something never recognized. Okay, without the cooperation of the upper caste, so-called upper caste Hindus, these affirmative uh, reservational policies that we legislated even before America did. We did it very soon, back in 40, 45, and things like even before independence. The affirmative action began then. So, you can say that without the cooperation of the upper caste, their cooperation, their agreement to go along with this, okay, it wouldn't have been possible. So, more or less, yes, can be said the same about the whites. Without the whites agreeing to it first, we wouldn't have been able to do it. Though, they will argue then, well, we fought a civil war over that. Well, then, Pete, I think it's time for puja. Nice talking to you. And we'll continue this discussion.